Hello and welcome to episode 2 of my challenged book summaries. If you're not sure why I'm saying challenged book instead of banned book, I explain that in episode 1 because it's a more accurate term of what's actually happening here in Canada, United States, in the United Kingdom, possibly other countries, but I've only really looked at the 3 that I just mentioned. In this episode, I'll be talking about 1984 by George Orwell, Lord of the Flies by William Golding, and Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. A couple of years ago, I picked up a collection of the 2 stories Animal Farm and 1984 by George Orwell. I read Animal Farm in 2023. I plan to read 1984 in 2024 because it was 40 years later. And I found it interesting that although everyone made this big hullabaloo about Back to the Future and the comparison of what the world looked like compared to what they said it was going to in the movie, I haven't come across anyone else making a comparison of 1984 and what the world looks like now in 2024. I've made a video about that. You can find that in my banned book playlist. So I'm not going to go over everything again in this video. Also, if you want a more historical perspective to understand George Orwell and how the different characters relate to what was going on in the world when he was writing this story, go over to Books, Songs, and Other Magic, where Gareth does an excellent job of explaining both the story of 1984 as well as sharing information about George Orwell. And he's also done a video about Animal Farm, so be sure to check those out. Back to 1984, also be sure to head over to Ven's Corner and check out his video on 1984 as he does a great job of describing that as well. The next book, Lord of the Flies, which I don't have a copy of, but it should be appearing up here. I read this in public school as it was our novel study. So I was familiar with the story, had an idea of what happened in it, but I haven't read it in decades, like 40 or so. The short version of the story is there's a group of boys, there's a plane crash, they're stranded on an island, there are no adults. At first, they all gather together as a group. They find a conch shell that they use to call the others in. They all watch after each other for the most part. The boys are of varying ages, from very small to early teens, and their goal is to try and get rescued. They consider making a fire. One of the boys, and only one of the boys, wears glasses, and that's what they use to get the fire started. They have people set up to man the fire, but of course, they're children. Things happen, things go wrong. As the days progress and no one has come, and again, there's no adult to provide or give them any type of instructions, eventually things start to shift throughout the group, and instead of one unified group for one common goal, they split off into 2 groups with very different goals and different behaviors. It's an important story and an important read because we see how things go from a united group together, why different things happened, and how that split comes apart. Sadly, not all of the boys survive until the end of the book, and one scene is particularly vicious and horrific, and the consequences of what happened during that is something that these boys will have to live with for the rest of their lives. I think it is a very important story to read For me, it was one that I think it's part of why I would always get irritated when, whether I was in public school, high school, or college, you'd have teachers set up this thing and go, well, what do you think you would do in that situation? And my response actually never varied. I have no idea. I'm not there. I know what I would like to think I would do in that situation. But unless you're there in the midst of it, you really can't say. And I think that's something that really comes out in Lord of the Flies and the way the different boys change and what happens and the outcome of all of that. I think it was also a book that for me was instrumental in my interest in psychology and why do people do some of the things they do, and what is that all about? Is it, their parents? Is it something with them and other issues? What is that all about? So that may have actually been the start to my road down into the path of psychology. And then part of that had to do with, yes, I loved astronomy, but my math skills just weren't that spectacular. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Now, this is a very short afternoon read with a lot of powerful stuff in it. I will say, trigger warning for anyone who has difficulty reading about animals and things not going very well. And there is a fair bit of that in this book, partly because the individual responsible has a multitude of other issues, so it isn't intentional, but the result is still the same. Our book follows two characters, George and Lenny. George has made a promise to someone that he will take care of Lenny. As you're reading this story, you also have to keep in mind that it is not a new book. The world was different. How people were treated back then were different, not just based on color. There are a lot of powerful things that come up in this particular book. George has done his best in a very difficult and challenging world. Because of different things that Lenny has done, they have to keep moving and finding work in other places. And we pick up the story when they're coming to a new farm. George gives Lenny certain instructions. Things are going well for a few days. Then an issue arises with a woman who is married to the son of the owner of where they're working. She's, best way I can put it, a piece of work. Not quite sure why she married someone who lives on a farm, but needless to say, there are a lot of problems, not just with George and Lenny, but the other workers as well. The owner's son is not what you would call a pleasant individual. Things go very bad very quick. Lenny does realize he can't stay at the farm. He takes off as he and George had an agreed place to meet if anything went wrong, partly because George already knew, sadly, that they don't really get to stay long anywhere because Lenny means well. He doesn't always intentionally do things, but the results have dire consequences, and this time even worse than before. It's an important read because you realize the different struggles that George is facing, but he made a promise and he does his best to keep that promise. Lenny has challenges. As I say, he doesn't do things intentionally, but that doesn't change the consequences of what he has done. Although I will likely never read this again because I am someone who finds it very difficult to read about things with animals, it is a story that I will certainly remember, and I am glad that I read it. Those are the three books that I wanted to cover in this video. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of them. What were your thoughts about them if you have? And until next time, take good care.